Dear friends, on this journey, let us begin by acknowledging the profound truth revealed to us by the spirit world. Life extends far beyond the brief span of our physical existence, and the visible world is but a small segment of a vast reality teeming with conscious beings. It is no accident that this message has found you, for the spiritual architecture of the universe is governed by the law of affinity and attraction, meaning we are perpetually drawn to the knowledge we are ready to receive and the frequencies we emit. In the great panorama of existence, we are never truly alone. The veil between the embodied and the disembodied is thin, permeable, and constantly traversed by thoughts and emotions. This is the starting point for understanding one of humanity's most insidious challenges, spiritual obsession. Allan Kardec, in his codification of the Spiritist doctrine, moved the concept of spiritual influence out of the realm of fear and superstition and placed it squarely within the domain of psychological and moral science. He clarified that obsession is the persistent action of an inferior or imperfect spirit upon an individual. This is not a judgment or a curse. It is a spiritual interaction defined by the compatibility of vibrations. When we experience inexplicable bouts of despair, relentless irritation, or a heaviness that paralyzes our will, we are often witnessing the effects of this persistent action. The danger, as Kardec explained in the Gospel according to Spiritism, is not in the mere proximity of a less evolved spirit, but in the subtle way this presence begins to mingle with and then dominate our own internal landscape. The spirit does not create entirely new thoughts. Rather, it identifies and amplifies the negative seeds, the pride, the resentment, the vanity, the fear that we already harbor. It is through the conscious, disciplined application of moral laws, as taught by the higher spirits, that we build the enduring defense they find so utterly intolerable. These methods are not magical rites, but the very fundamentals of spiritual evolution, which disrupt the obsessive link at its source, our moral and intellectual vibration. Before delving into the methods of defense, we must first truly understand the nature of the adversary, not as a demon, but as a suffering, often vengeful, brother or sister who remains mentally and morally entangled in the inferior sphere. Kardec categorized obsession into three primary forms in the medium's book: simple obsession, fascination, and subjugation, each marking a progressive level of control that the perturbing spirit achieves. Simple obsession is the most common, where the spirit intrudes through suggestion, often preventing communications from more elevated sources or introducing disruptive thoughts. The afflicted person is aware of the foreign nature of the influence and can resist it, even if the annoyance is frequent. This level of influence thrives on our momentary lapses in moral vigilance. Fascination, however, is a much more dangerous stage. Here, the obsessing spirit employs a cunning, fluidic action that, as Kardec meticulously explained, creates an illusion for the victim, entirely altering their judgment. The fascinated person is utterly deluded. They perceive the absurd as sublime, the ridiculous as profound, and their own actions, no matter how irrational or foolish, seem completely justifiable and meritorious. They become immune to all rational advice or criticism, believing themselves to be guided by the highest wisdom. The spirit accomplishes this not by seizing the body, but by clouding the soul's ability to discern truth, feeding the victim's pride and vanity to maintain the illusion. This form is particularly resistant to external help, as the individual refuses to recognize the necessity of aid. The most severe form is subjugation, where the spirit literally paralyzes the victim's will and compels them to act against their own interests or morality, sometimes affecting physical movements, and at other times resulting in a profound moral paralysis. This level of obsession, frequently rooted in past life grievances, binds the obsessing and the obsessed in a mutual state of suffering and spiritual debt. The central teaching of Kardec on this matter is crucial. Obsession is almost always rooted in the spirit of vengeance, arising from a conflict between the spirits, often dating back to a previous incarnation where one may have been the oppressor and the other the victim. To break this chain is not a matter of fighting fire with fire, but of applying the purifying waters of moral reform, for the obsessing spirit maintains its hold only because it finds a point of moral contact, a vulnerability, in the obsessing person's own imperfections. The obsessors detest the methods we are about to discuss because these methods directly attack that point of moral contact, severing the bond of mutual imperfection. The first and most immediately effective method, an instrument of spiritual elevation that obsessors utterly abhor, is sincere, heartfelt prayer. This is not the mechanical recitation of memorized words. It is, as the elevated spirits taught Kardec in the Gospel according to Spiritism, the spontaneous, honest outpouring of the soul to its creator. The power of prayer lies in its fluidic effect, its ability to transform the subtle atmosphere that surrounds us, the perispiritual sphere, and to attract the most elevated spiritual resources. In the Spiritist view, prayer is an act of alignment, a concentrated use of thought that radiates a specific powerful vibration. When a person prays with profound faith, humility, and genuine love, they instantaneously break the negative frequency established by the obsessing spirit. The spirit, being a lower vibration entity, finds itself in an environment that is suddenly and intensely incompatible with its own nature, much like a creature of the dark suddenly exposed to the brilliance of noonday sun. The prayer, when sincere, is an electric discharge of moral light. It is an act of will that declares independence from negative suggestion and repositions the soul within the benevolent circuit of divine laws. Furthermore, prayer is the most direct way to call upon the assistance of the good spirits, our invisible friends and protectors, who are always ready to aid us, provided we open the door through our elevated desire. As the spirits state in the Spirit's book, we attract spirits to us through the affinity of our thoughts and intentions. A heart turned to God and focused on the good, even if just for a moment, creates an intense fluidic center that draws the superior spirits closer. These superior beings then envelop the praying individual with protective, regenerative fluids, neutralizing the pernicious fluidic atmosphere that the obsessor has projected onto the victim. Kardec noted that in cases of severe obsession, the victim is impregnated with a harmful fluid that must be dispersed. Sincere prayer is the quickest way for the victim to initiate this fluidic cleansing themselves. The obsessing spirit hates this because it witnesses its painstakingly constructed fluidic prison dissolving before the irresistible force of true faith, seeing its prey being rescued by forces it cannot contend with. They detest the light because they thrive in the darkness of the heart, and sincere prayer is a declaration of light. If prayer is the elevation of the soul, then charity is the necessary movement of the body and the will, translating elevated thought into beneficial action. The spirits unequivocally stated to Kardec, "Outside of charity there is no salvation," emphasizing that true charity encompasses not only material aid, but also tolerance, kindness, forgiveness, and the effort to see the good in our neighbor. This active, disinterested practice is the second method that spirits of an inferior order find utterly repellent, for it starves their primary source of sustenance, our egoism and pride. Obsessors, being souls who are often steeped in egoism, envy, and a desire for domination, are utterly incapable of tolerating an atmosphere of selfless love and fraternity. When an individual engages in active charity, be it through consoling a distressed soul, teaching a useful skill, patiently enduring a difficult situation, or simply thinking kindly of an enemy, they are generating a fluidic current of such purity that the obsessing spirit cannot remain attached. The act of turning one's attention and effort outward, towards the well-being of others, is a declaration of moral victory over the self-centeredness that is the foundation of all spiritual vulnerability. Kardec meticulously detailed that the obsessing spirit maintains its influence through a process of moral and energetic syntony. The obsessor, often motivated by revenge, pride, or a deep-seated unhappiness, seeks an echo of its own imperfections in the victim. When the victim begins to live a life dedicated to charity and service, the moral gap between the two rapidly widens. The victim's heart, once a fertile ground for the obsessor's suggestions of hate, envy, or bitterness, becomes an engine of love and compassion. This moral polarity is unsupportable for the inferior spirit. It is driven away not by force, but by a visceral incompatibility of vibration, finding no familiar footing upon which to anchor its destructive thoughts. Charity is the practical antidote to egoism, and since egoism is the root of all evil, Charity is the practical spiritual sword that cuts the obsessive link. The obsessors detest charity because it represents the very moral progress they have failed to achieve and refuse to acknowledge, a visible, tangible proof that their victim is transcending the sphere of influence they seek to maintain. The dedicated practice of goodness creates an unbreachable fortress of light around the individual. The third pillar, and perhaps the most crucial in maintaining the inner fortress, is the relentless, unwavering discipline of thoughts, which Kardec refers to as vigilance, in alignment with the teachings of Jesus Christ. Obsessors hate this more than almost anything else, because the mind is their principal and most vulnerable point of entry. It is through the unmonitored thought, the fleeting resentment, the secret envy, the cherished plan of revenge, or the simple discouragement that the obsessing spirit gains traction. In the Spiritist understanding, every thought we emit is a fluidic current, a form of active energy that attracts like-minded spirits. Our mind is a spiritual beacon, constantly broadcasting and receiving. When we allow our mind to dwell on dark, destructive, or frivolous subjects, we are effectively tuning our internal radio to the station of less evolved spirits. Kardec explained that these spirits are not creators of new ideas, but masterful exploiters of existing flaws. They take the seed of irritation and water it until it becomes explosive rage. They take the whisper of doubt and nurture it until it becomes paralyzing despair. The undisciplined mind is an open door, a vast untended field where negative suggestions take root and flourish effortlessly. The discipline of thoughts is the conscious, moment-by-moment process of filtering what we accept and what we reject in our mental sphere. It is the practice of immediately replacing a thought of criticism with a thought of blessing, transforming a feeling of self-pity into an affirmation of divine reliance, and countering the impulse for anger with an invocation of patience. This does not mean suppressing emotions, which is a form of hypocrisy, but rather educating them. It means recognizing the negative emotion, understanding its nature, and actively choosing a higher, more constructive response. By doing so, the individual erects a formidable barrier that the obsessing spirit cannot cross. The spirit needs resonance. It requires the victim to accept and feed the negative suggestion. When the disciplined mind instantly discards the thought, refusing to let it take root, the obsessing spirit's influence is nullified, its connection severed by a powerful, conscious act of free will. This practice, particularly before sleep, as the spirit emancipates and is most vulnerable to nocturnal assault, is a critical layer of spiritual defense. The obsessors are repelled by this inner vigilance because it completely disarms their most potent tool, manipulation of the victim's own mind. It is essential to understand that these three methods, sincere prayer, active charity, and disciplined thought, are not merely three separate tools to be used in isolation, but a unified, integrated system of moral and spiritual perfection. They form a spiritual tripod, as Kardec's teachings consistently demonstrate, where the strength of the whole depends on the integrity of each part. The obsessor's intense aversion to these practices stems from this very synergy. Their power is multiplied exponentially when practiced together. Consider the dynamic. Sincere prayer elevates the mind and heart, connecting the soul to the higher spheres and bringing down cleansing, beneficial fluids. This elevated state makes it easier to engage in active charity, as the heart is less constrained by egoism and more readily inspired by compassion. The act of charity, in turn, generates a flow of pure, constructive energy, strengthening the will and providing moral grounding, which then makes the discipline of thoughts easier to sustain. Conversely, a failure in one area weakens the entire defense. A person may pray devoutly, but if they allow their thoughts to dwell on resentment and neglect to act charitably towards their neighbor, the moral breach remains open. The obsessor, finding the door of resentment ajar, will use it to negate the positive fluidic effects of the prayer. The union of these three practices creates a profound moral and energetic stability that renders the individual inaccessible to inferior spirits. The person becomes a living beacon of light. Their thoughts are monitored and constructive, their heart is flowing with love and service, and their connection to the divine is maintained through constant elevation. This stability is the spiritual equivalent of an impregnable fortress. The obsessing spirits are not driven away by a magic word, they are displaced by the fundamental law of affinity. They flee because they are suffocated by the moral light, finding no affinity, no common ground, and no vulnerable fissure to exploit. They detest this unity because it represents a spiritual maturity that signifies their definitive loss of control over the individual, transforming the victim into an active agent of light and a potential benefactor to the obsessors themselves. In the highest teachings imparted to Allan Kardec, a profound truth emerges. Even the painful process of obsession, while devastating, is ultimately a mechanism for accelerated spiritual progress. The spirits explain that obsession, especially when rooted in past life vengeance, presents the perfect opportunity for the obsessed individual to settle old debts through forgiveness and charity, thus resolving the karmic link permanently. The suffering caused by the obsessor forces the victim to seek out and engage with the very moral resources they had previously neglected. The struggle with an obsessing spirit compels the person to adopt the practices of prayer, charity, and discipline, the very virtues that lead to spiritual elevation. In essence, the obsessing spirit, without knowing it, becomes a severe but ultimately effective teacher. When the victim finally understands the dynamic and chooses to forgive the obsessing spirit, prays for their enlightenment, and strengthens their own moral life, they not only liberate themselves, but also send out a powerful fluidic current of love and forgiveness that can initiate the obsessing spirit's own redemption. The obsessing spirit, receiving this unexpected torrent of love instead of the reciprocal hate it sought, is often bewildered, disarmed, and eventually drawn away from its inferior state. The final triumph of these three methods is their transformative power. They do not merely defend the person, they perfect them. They shift the focus from a state of passive victimhood to one of active moral agency. When an individual adopts this integrated life of sustained elevation, they move beyond the need for constant defense. They no longer fear the presence of the shadows because they have become an inexhaustible source of light. Their conduct is their shield, their love is their weapon, and their thought is their constant connection to the divine. This state of persistent moral effort is the definitive antidote to all negative spiritual influences, a practical demonstration that the true enemy is not the disembodied spirit, but the moral imperfection within oneself that grants the spirit entry. We have explored the profound nature of spiritual influence, moving beyond superstition to the clear moral science provided by the Spiritist doctrine. The methods are clear yet demanding. The sincere prayer that elevates the fluidic vibration and attracts superior assistance, the active disinterested charity that eradicates egoism and severs the moral link of negative affinity, and the unwavering discipline of thoughts that closes the mind's door to all destructive suggestion. These three are the unbreakable triple shield that obsessors hate, not because they are magical, but because they represent the inevitable progress of the soul. Let us commit to living this elevated life, for the true security of the soul lies not in external rituals, but in the steadfast fidelity to the moral laws of God. By choosing to live in prayer, to act in charity, and to govern our thoughts with discipline, we transform ourselves into living temples of light. We cease to be the target of the shadow and become instead a source of irradiation, extending a chain of light and hope to all those who still wander in the darkness, including our former adversaries. Let this certainty settle within your heart. You are not helpless, and the most powerful defense in the universe is the love and moral goodness you choose to cultivate within yourself. Thus we fulfill the great law of Christ and ensure that no darkness can ever reside where the light of the soul burns brightly.